My name is 23 years old. Been living in Baltimore my whole life. This is the first time I've ever really witnessed our city really get out of hand like this. There are a lot of educated people that have a lot of great things to say and great ideas as to how we can change the situation, but the leadership hasn't really been there. You know, we have a few people like Reverend Jamal Bryant that's really been speaking out and trying to promote peace, but for the most part, these young teens that are doing a lot of this mischief are all misguided youth. A lot of them now are, have gotten to the liquor store and now they're drunk. It's not a good representation of what the true cause or the true meaning of this event is. So don't let this one incident or our anger be the representation of who we are or what we stand for. Because as a people, we need to unite, and this isn't unity.
Let me chime in for a second. It is disorganized, but it's also I say disorganized. This is disorganized. But what happens is it makes a statement. It says that we no longer taking you breaking my back. We no longer taking you pulling my pants down in the middle of the alley. We no longer going for that you're going to take me and humiliate me every day. Now, this disorganized, but what it does is it sends a message that we're tired, we're fed up, and we're not walking with a sign no more. This is our sign. Yeah,
I understand that.
Yeah, this is our sign now. This is our picket sign. No more we walking with a picket sign, because this is bullshit.
So let's talk a little bit about April 27th, 2015, what many people call the Baltimore Uprising, and something that I have wrestled with a lot. I was on the corner of North and Fulton for some measure of it, and in other parts of that area of West Baltimore as everything was going down, and I have always really wrestled with how to describe it, because there were certainly persons I observed for whom this moment did seem like an explicit political statement, whatever they were doing, and I think of, this one kid I saw who's like still in khakis and a backpack, right? Like this kid was in school earlier that day, and I'm at North and Fulton, and suddenly this armored SWAT-like vehicle comes through and down North Avenue, turns left on Fulton and drives off. But this kid is in the middle of the road and grabs a stool, which I'm not even sure how this stool ended up in the middle of North. It's one of those funny sort of things. Like, where did he get a stool? But he throws it at this car. Like, this kid was like, I am tired of the way police are treating us, and here is my statement. But I also saw a lot of people who were just like, I got some Ciroc out the store, that I just looted, and so it's always difficult for me to sort of navigate how I should interpret that, especially because, standing on that corner, you're watching some people who are actively involved in, whether you want to call it uprising or rioting, whatever it is, because that's essentially the conversation we're having now. But there were also just a lot of people who were members of the community who are just kind of watching this unfold, watching their neighborhood go through this convulsion. And there were those who were like, I have a recording where one person is saying there's no more marching. This is our picket sign now, right? This is our picket sign. There's no more, I am a man. That's over. This is what we're doing. And, the other guy's like, just so you understand from the street perspective, these are our soldiers. They're repping us right now. But there was also the guy who walked by and is just shaking his head going how does stealing hair and drinks help us? What, and so I can't help but notice that a lot of the people who insist that you have to refer to it as an uprising specifically were not the people, throwing stools at armored cop vehicles as they drove through, right? These people were nowhere to be seen. And it's not unusual for when things pop off for the activists to suddenly be ghost. And so I have a complicated relationship when these activists are like, you have to, interpret this event according to our paradigm when we ran when push came to shove, and we left all these poor kids who actually live in this neighborhood and are vulnerable to things like police harassment and unjustified arrest to do the fighting for us. And so it's just become this really sort of complicated question. Yeah, and especially I think a lot about that Martin Luther King quotation that, gets bandied about a lot. The riot as the language of the unheard. Okay, so if that is true, is calling a riot and uprising a silencing of the unheard.
That's such an interesting twist on words there. You kind of made me smile to myself. Yeah, I don't see it your way. I think that's a good question to ask there, that the riot is a language of the unheard. And so I think words shift over time. And I don't think that riot, the way he was using it, would be what we associate it with today. I don't think that he was saying that the Pumpkin Festival riot was the language of the oppressed, pumpkin chucking white people from the Northeast. So I don't think that's the definition of nerd. I think he would define riot more like how we would define uprising at the moment. And I do go with the uprising, and I do push that, because even from a technical point, a riot is something that the oppressed start. And here it was unique that the people did not start this event. The police started this event. And
the police begged for this event.
They physically started it in 2 locations and psychologically started it with the handling of killing Freddie Gray. So, and the long history that led to this, because Freddie Gray is kind of a martyr in a sense that he represents what anyone in Baltimore in these neighborhoods could find themselves in. He was one of, like, it is like he's Freddie Gray, I'm Freddie Gray, she's Freddie Gray, because it's such a cumulative effect of this system.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I spent 2 weeks standing in front of a police line at North and Cary after April 27th, in the days, through the period when Mosby announced the charges, right? And that's when the sort of demonstrations dissipated and the National Guard left the city. And a lot of the young people I talked to, that is exactly what they expressed. We are angry about this because I'm tired of getting stopped and stripped and, I'm being humiliated. And this is a regular feature of my daily existence. And, when I think of that kid throwing the stool at the armored car, in that moment, I just felt like this person is reacting to a trauma, right? Like he is taking in that moment sort of power over situations, whether it was 1 or 1 million, that he never had control over. In that moment, he finally got to fight back, right? I'm done with the humiliations, whether it was of him or a family member or, both, or a friend, and I think for many folks in these communities, these are, there are always sort of like various traumas related to police interactions inevitably, because it's not just what has happened to you, it's also what you constantly see happening to the people you care about. But especially in light of my approach to my work, I'm very hesitant to speak for those persons. I wasn't throwing anything at a police car that day, so I don't feel like I should have a say in how it should be described. And I saw enough nuance on that day to be hesitant to label it one way or another. But I do sort of really appreciate your observation that we have to be careful to focus on the content of the word, not the form, right? Not the sort of semantic of it. Because we might be meaning the same thing, but just using a different word.
Right, and that's what actually matters. It's not the subjective things, it's the objective things. But going back to what you started this conversation off with, is that I would like to challenge you a little bit that you're associating with the boy with the stool, because that's a context that you understand. And a lot of people kind of push back on me a little bit when I say that I'm not interested in criticizing how the oppressed respond to their oppression, or even trying to understand it. I am interested in assuring that they don't have to find a way to express that. And to some people, I personally can kind of grasp how they may turn to breaking into a store and grabbing those things they couldn't get, or the fact, like, to them, we may say, oh, look at him getting that bottle of Hennessy, but that's $40. Well, if I was oppressed and you do that comparatively, well, that might be like that filet mignon for a week that I can't afford to have. So like
Sure,
maybe
yeah.
would an expression of my oppression be to steal that filet mignon and be like, I'm eating like you motherfuckers for a night. This is going to be great. Like I get how that is valid.
No, and I don't disagree that anything that I saw that day was itself a function of that history of oppression and of the personal experience of any given individual. But I also have to reconcile with the fact that after I'd been on the corner of North and Fulton for a while, I start walking west down North Avenue. And as I'm walking down, you know, I come across a couple of older guys that are in front of this building. And they're like, we just want to make sure people know this is black owned so they don't attack it, right? Then I walk a little further and I come across this guy that I had done a profile on his gym that's there on North Avenue. You know, they do like a mixed martial arts training and things. And he's standing out there with an aluminum bat. Like, hey, I'm just like trying to protect my business, right? And so I don't want to say like I'm a Latino male in the United States. You know, I'm from Puerto Rico. And I grew up in the northeastern United States where Puerto Ricans are not particularly welcome as an ethnic group, you know, when it comes to this question of sort of like racism and law enforcement. And so I know something of oppression, but I also have to acknowledge that like both my parents are college professors, you know, with PhDs. I grew up in a college town. To the extent that my reality has been informed by racial animus directed at me, it is different, severely, you know, different than the sort of experience poor African Americans are enduring in places like East and West Baltimore. But nonetheless, I do feel like the oppressed bear a responsibility to at least be self-reflexive enough to understand that we also, I think, at times participate in that oppression, and that I don't know. This is a complicated question for me, but you know, I can't help but notice that there are a lot of ways in which oppressed people also like really not so much reinforce their own oppression, but reinforce power structures that are also oppressive within their own context. And again, I mean, this is exactly what you're talking about. Like oppression twists people's humanity. So you can't sort of like look at an oppressed population and be like, how come you don't have some deep philosophical understanding? But it's hard not to deny that, you know, in communities like this, there's a violence against women, for example. That is certainly, I think, an exaggerated reflection of the basic misogyny that it informs all of Western civilization and has, since we said, like Eve, brought sin into the world. But, you know, I just wrestle a lot with this. As someone who's like a person of color, but not exactly, you know, what people imagine when we say that term, and who feels strongly, not just that we have to fight oppression, but that we have to fight the basic intellectual commitments that inform the capacity for oppression, not the least of which is just the basic way we define ourselves as human beings. The idea that the human being is rational is, in my reading of intellectual history, the basis of all identity-based violence. And so at what point is there a responsibility on our end to sort of acknowledge certain things and make sure that as we fight oppression, we're not just fighting our oppression, we're fighting oppression generally? This is a weird conversation for me and you to be having.
I think it's okay because I mean it's from an intellectual perspective, not the other way around. I just don't buy the premise that the oppressed have essentially any responsibility, because part of that oppression, like the restriction of education, is part of that oppression. So we can't judge them for not knowing if our systems and structures that we support specifically keep them from knowing. So the burden is always on the leaders. It's always for us to look up for responsibility and not look down. So I do understand how people can get individual accounts, these anecdotal examples of personal responsibility. I get all that, but in structures and in systems and in ways of thinking, we can't be so narrowly focused.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I mean, and when I talk about sort of personal responsibility, it's not about personal responsibility for the oppression itself, but to the extent that oppression is a function of historical contingency, so it's not something that I can control and turn off, right? It will take a long time to undo these things. And in undoing these things, who knows what other forms of oppression might arise that we will also inevitably one day have to address. But for the person who is subject to oppression, the question of personal responsibility, I think, is relevant to the way we sort of navigate and fight against oppression, right? To the extent that we are engaged in that project. And not everybody, obviously, in the vein of like...
Yeah, but dude, the oppressed can't end their oppression. Like, the oppressors are the only ones that can end the oppression. So their responses have no bearing on the... If we're talking about an algebra equation here, their actions are not even a variable in the equation.
But right, like, so, you know, I sort of think of myself as a student of history more than anything else. And it's hard not to deny that when you have oppressed communities who then come to power, it's rare that they don't themselves enact some form of oppression, right? And to the extent that there are people, say, you know, just to give an example, like Israel-Palestine, you know, if you know anything about Western history, it's hard to disagree with the position that Jews have been unfairly targeted, hated, and persecuted for thousands of years, and that they should desire a state of their own where they could protect themselves, frankly, right? And just at least not be the whipping post for every single issue ever. But it's hard to ignore the fact that they, in establishing this state, themselves have engaged in an act of oppression. And at some point, I do feel like if you only fight against your oppression and not oppression more broadly, are we actually against oppression, or are we against our oppression, right? Are we against power, or are we against the fact that I don't have enough power? Because I can get with one of those commitments, but I can't get with the other.
It doesn't matter. So if you are fighting for your own oppression, then that has effects that transcend. So women did not get the right to vote until black people fought for the right to vote, and they forgot to specify only black men, and then it automatically went to all women. And a lot of these rights went that way. So you start...
But I mean, women won the franchise later.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
because
they opened the door.
Because they opened the door, then that's what leads to these other things. Now, the other angle that I would like for you to think about is that is why the oppressors bear the responsibility. Because if the oppressors make a system, because they have the power, if you could say, look, we're going to get taken over here if we keep doing this. So since we have the power, we need to develop a system that lifts all boats so that instead of having civil war, we can also survive instead of having a violent revolt against us. That is the point of giving in to rioting and uprising, is to say, okay, we were wrong. How do we do this so that it's good for everybody? Then that creates a system, which is like when we talk about reparations, like I'm a supporter of reparations, but here's my big problem. I think that the black community is going to, as a whole, have to sacrifice their individualism in it, because what their case for reparations has demonstrated is that everyone subjected to these barriers in life need these advantages to lift all boats. So I think like the black community as a whole will end up having to go down as a martyr for the more socialist constructs that will create a better environment for everybody.
Yeah, and look, I mean, you know, the reason this is such a sort of challenging question for me is because I agree with everything you've said. Like, I would never be like, no, well, I guess the wrinkle is that for oppressed people, in the same way that they're in no way responsible for their oppression, they are also in no position to make the oppressor do anything. So in light of that,
the only way they have to make the oppressor do something is to say, look, you change this or we burn it all down. Like, I get concerned that like the concept or the idea of rioting or rioters or the oppressed is kind of maybe like the interpretation of terrorism, which is basically a matter of perspective and nothing
definitely.
else.
Yeah.
So we always have to remember with terrorism that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. The entire Revolutionary War was legitimately perceived by the British as a rioting uprising of people who are taking over the oligarchy, and it's the exact same thing. We're literally founded on this idea of you serve us or we will burn this motherfucker down.
Yeah.
That's America from its very roots. And then we want to say make it great again. I'm cool with that. Make it so that if you don't serve the weakest among you, we burn this motherfucker down.
So I think we've kind of returned to the sort of metaphysical problem, which is you're absolutely right. You're right. One man's terrorist, another man's freedom fighter, which speaks to the idea that truth is perspectival, not really objective, or to the extent that it's objective, it's always going to be contingent on the object. So, yeah, this mic stand is black, but that has nothing to do with any other mic stand. That's just has, it happened to be painted that color.
And you happen to call it black, and we happen to perceive it.
That's how we refer to this color,
and it's an illusion, like we discussed.
No, exactly. That's not an actual thing. That's just how my eye interprets this wavelength of light when it bounces off this object and punches me in the face. And so I wonder then at this point is perhaps the problem for me is that I've sort of rejected the idea that truth is objective in this way, but my Western inheritance keeps sort of forcing me back to try to find an objective principle that could sort of settle the issue.
But there are. So, like, that's the thing in social sciences. What we try to do is we try to make social science equate to physical sciences.
Yeah, but I think that's the problem with our social sciences. And that's why I think our social sciences tend to reinforce our biases through the reinforcement of those categories, because we're inevitably trying to measure things we socially constructed.
Right, because they're trying to measure quantitative data in a qualitative environment.
Yes.
Right? So that's my big problem with any of these things when it comes to policing or what should we do with social ideas is that anyone can pick up hundreds, thousands of outliers, but the truth lies in the trends. It's not in these specific looking. So the best way to get people to say that in an area I'm constantly harping on is lead poisoning and environmental poisoning of these communities. So you will see the trends of lead poisoning reduction following the trends of violent crime reduction. But if you were to look at any individual who was poisoned, your data would be shit. You don't have any truth in that. The truth is in the biggest sample size that you can get and what trends flow throughout that. So if you get trends that say lead poisoning is this huge contributor to violent crime and you attack lead poisoning, as that goes down, the trends for other variables influencing crime will become more prominent and we will see them, and then thus that will become the common thread that we begin to address, and you continue in a cycle that's constantly looking at trends because that's what we need to see. We can't look at these small amounts of data when it comes to social sciences.
It's been another episode of Nuance. Join us next week when I discuss my issues with my mother.
Nobody loves me. The only reason I'm doing this is because I feel inadequate about people looking at me and giving me recognition for all the hard work.